Welcome to everybody joining us from the various corners of our world home. It is a humbling experience to share this moment with you today, a moment that I believe will go down in history as optimistically as the moment where the world got serious about curbing climate change and averted the disaster. My name is Francisco Bando, and I work as Policy and Program Manager at the University of Oxford for the Peak Urban and the Oxford Martin Program on Informal Cities. Of course, by now you will have guessed that this is a fully pre-recorded session, but we are here reading your comments and questions in the chat, and we invite you to make comments because they will serve as content for a briefing that we will create and send back to you. If you register on the link, we will have the opportunity to send you that briefing as well as other documents that come from this meeting. And of course, I would say definitely don't sit back and relax, but rather engage actively with the speakers and ask yourself, how does what they're saying resonate with my work? Does it change or have implications for how I study or how I work, how I live life in my neighborhood or city? We'll hear first from Alex Ricardo Jimenez. He is from the Arup Colombia office, a sustainability planner. He'll talk to us about his firm. Arup needs no introduction. For 75 years, they've been building positive change around the world.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Alex Jimenez. I am from Bogota, Colombia, and I currently lead the urban design and planning team in Arup in Bogota, Colombia. I'm very thankful, I'm very glad I've been invited to join this conversation about understanding systems and tools for change in cities. I'm going to quickly share a presentation that will help me in guiding my intervention. So to start off, I will pose the question about how does Arup approach the motto of shaping a better world? So to answer this, I will start with our commitment and alignment to the Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, our global strategy is based upon the achievement of such goals. And we do take it very seriously. For us, sustainable development means everything. And also, every decision that we make and every decision that we are making is trying to be more and more aligned to these goals. For us, it's very important, the environment, the communities, the well-being and the health of every citizen are in this world. And second, I would like to highlight the legacy of our founder, Sir of Arup. He left a set of values and beliefs. He said this concept of really looking at the world from a total architecture perspective. Every different discipline, every different perspective has to be incorporated when trying to solve problems. So we look at issues, problems, situations holistically and systematically. We try to strive for curiosity, for always asking the right questions or even the wrong questions, but also trying to go to the root of the problems. We also strive for creativity and innovation, and we aim to work collaboratively and across disciplines. Finally, I would highlight that we really are after high social impact. And this is fundamental to every decision and the projects that we engage. Does the firm leverage technology using data and new methods? I would say yes. And I'm just going to show you a set of tools that we have created internally to help us address the current global challenges. So this is a Sphere, which is a sustainability appraisal tool that helps us in understanding some of the goals and challenges that clients have with regard to different dimensions of sustainability. To the right, you can see the graphic derived from a master plan that we helped a client for a real estate development here in Bogota, Colombia. So it is a very simple graph that as you are closer to the center, your goals are aiming for that sustainability targets. Also, ARU developed a tool called Mass Motion, which helps clients understand how different spaces, such as train stations, big scenarios, theaters, or even public spaces, can develop based on pedestrian simulations. So this tool actually was very useful during the pandemic. We could help clients understand how these different set of spaces could be used using the parameters of social distance. Another tool that we help the Rockefeller Foundation is the City Resiliency Index and Framework. This online platform helps different set of stakeholders, but in particular cities, to craft and understand the resiliency challenges holistically. Also, we have worked with different C40 cities supported by the Clinton Climate Initiative in, for instance, creating some of the climate action plans in a different set of cities. Also, we have partnered with the Lloyd's Register Foundation in creating a platform that is called the Resilience Shift, that is going to help a different set of stakeholders to bridge infrastructure systems gap to create a safer and more resilient future for everyone. Also, a related tool to urban resilience is the city water resilience approach, which helps also cities to understand how the different urban water systems can be more resilient and can help in building resiliency to the different type of urban environments. Does the framework across sectors, across disciplines, and do we involve communities? Yes. I would say that it's at the core of our business, in the core of our actions, and in the core of the way we do things daily. This is just a picture of an example. This is our work with Montevideo in Uruguay throughout the definition of the urban resiliency strategy for that city. Also, we work across disciplines when we frame our projects in different type of cities. We look at people, we look at water, we look at ecology, we look at economy, we look at the sociology of the city. And we like and enjoy, and we actually go abide by these type of interactions between different disciplines. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of our philosophy and our legacy. We'll look and strive to combine different concepts, different perspectives, and solve problems in an integrated manner. And it's a firm like ours finding some challenges when building cities and when trying to affect change in cities? And I would say it's definitely yes. Cities are dynamic and they also have political will. This poses some challenges. For instance, the fact that some of the administrative cycles change permanently. And so long-term visions sometimes are challenging to find. However, we have found that cities are very entrepreneurial as well as their local officials. So we believe that really helping cities create visions, trying to set specific and very clear objectives and goals can help them in creating these long-term visions that could, in fact, also contribute to overcoming those administrative cycles. So I'm going to leave it like that, and I hope my intervention would create further discussions. Thank you very much for your time.
We will now hear from Jaideep Gupta. He is lead of the Cities and Sustainable Infrastructure portfolio at GCRF. He is research fellow and leader of the Cities Cluster at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and he was formerly research fellow at the Urban Design Research Institute in Mumbai, India. Jaideep today will answer two important questions. First, Why is it important to fund both cities-focused research and knowledge exchange activity in low and middle income countries to affect an effective response on climate change? And second, what different roles can academic research and knowledge exchange activity play in bringing knowledges together and creating tools for climate action?
I'm Jaideep Gupta, Senior Fellow of the Institute of Development Studies, and I'm also the Challenge Leader for Cities and Sustainable Infrastructure at UKRI. It is important to simultaneously fund both cities-focused research and knowledge exchange activity in low and middle income countries, and particularly across a range of institutions like universities and policy-engaged research organizations. Globally, we are in the midst of a dramatic urban transition, not just in terms of our cities growing, but described by a wide variety of socio-spatial urbanization processes. Scalar urbanization stretching to metro regions, blurring of urban territories from city center to small towns, the simultaneous expansion of industrial urbanization into the hinterland. Critical to note here are the ways in which processes of urbanization reach across space and interact in flows of people, goods, and capital. And of course, while the continents of Europe, North America, and Latin America already have a majority of their population living in towns and cities, 90% of the additional 2.5 billion people worldwide are expected in urban areas by 2050 will be concentrated in Asia and Africa. So the very first step is to understand the important environmental, social, technological complexities of this transition. And to do so, we require a multi-scalar, multidisciplinary, multi-actor research environment. To be adaptive, cities, towns, and local regions need to be able to draw on cutting-edge thinking and researchers. And at the same time, researchers need to be close to practitioners on the ground to understand the issues being faced. UKRI's approach has been to fund research working directly with least resourced or otherwise marginalized communities and cities, with a great deal of emphasis placed on equitability in research partnerships to arrive at the relevant issues, and thereby also amplify the voices of the most marginalized communities. A second point to make here is that the language of research is often the bridge to help communities connect with their policymakers and to inform their decision-making. New tools and research innovations are required to place the most accurate and most up-to-date evidence into advocacy environments. But at the same time, what is required is an empowering of those who are least resourced or most marginalized and therefore at most risk from changes to our climate, but least able to shape the policy decisions that affect their immediate living and working environments. So there are significant roles and responsibilities here for research mediation. To ensure adequate handholding where required, capacity strengthening where needed. These are the types of research innovations, the types of enabling and equitable relationships that are evident in programs like Peak Urban and in organizations such as the World Resources Institute. So I'm delighted you'll hear more from them in this event. The scales at which research is organized are also significant here. And we can see that impactful research, knowledge generation, capacity strengthening are all focused on the drivers of risk and emissions rising out of both large and small spatial social dynamics of urbanization, as well as, I suppose, the significance of justice and equity issues across generations, particularly in the light of the levels of risk that will be created to future generations. So making evidence-based policy recommendations relevant will require tailoring them to the specific sectoral responsibilities of different actors within urban areas, but also at the appropriate scales. UKRI funds all kinds of research, curiosity-driven, applied, knowledge exchange activities to translate research for policy and practice. each of these can and do operate at multiple scales, from a molecular level, understanding materials or indeed health impacts, right through to sub-municipal, city, regional, national, and even transnational scales. So it is vital that we enable each of these scales and allow for transitions and translation between scales. Now, this involves traversing local to non-local scales, as I mentioned, but also translating research and evidence from the global south to other southern contexts and to northern contexts, recognizing that achieving sustainable infrastructure, equitability in cities in the UK and other developed country contexts is part of the global challenge, and that innovation, learning, discovery happen all over the world. So as a public funder, UKRI research is assessed on actualizing benefits internationally as well as in the UK. A final point, we must not forget that while we are all responding to the same global pressures of climate hazards and risks, there are critical differences in capacities, in resources and financing options available. So, for example, where data ecosystems have led to transformative adaptation, open data landscapes for cities have adopted transnational standards to ensure interoperability amongst the widest possible set of technology providers, local authorities, citizen stakeholders. But in the fastest urbanizing regions of the world, we see a critical gap between the technological solutions, for example, being suggested, and whether they contribute to inclusive, resilient, and sustainable responses from the perspective of economically, socially disadvantaged urban residents. It is therefore paramount that we invest in curiosity-driven research, but simultaneously have strategic research-led actions to strengthen capacities in critical areas like equity, just transitions, and resilience. Thank you for taking the time to join this Resilience Hub event, and I'm delighted to have spoken at it. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Peak Urban and the WRI Ross Center on their key findings and outcomes relating to systems and tools for change in cities. Thank you.
Now I'll give way to an intervention from the World Resource Institute. The Institute is a global research organization that works with all of society to develop practical solutions that improve people's lives and protect nature. Anjali Mahendra will give an intervention. She is Director of Global Research and leads the research agenda, guiding a worldwide team in conducting policy-relevant research, innovative and interdisciplinary research. As a recognized transport expert, Anjali has taught graduate-level courses on transportation, policy, and authored publications in urban transport and land use and other topics. She is passionate about connecting research with practice and has worked in the USA, in Latin America, and in India. Anjali will now outline the transitions to a more equal city.
Not everyone experiences cities in the same way. Daily activities are easy for some and a struggle for others. The gap between those with access to basic services and those without creates daily burdens and disparities that echo for generations. This is the urban services divide. Over 1 billion people globally and 2 in 3 urban residents in low-income countries are underserved. For them, water may be available only a few hours a week, and access to jobs requires arduous and unsafe journeys. The results are costly, time-consuming, self-provision, and unhealthy, polluting practices. The cumulative human and environmental cost of the urban services divide impacts everyone. Closing it benefits us all.
My name is Anjali Mahendra, and we're delighted to have you all join us today. Thanks for being here. Now, if I were to ask you how you're doing today, you'd probably tell me about your experience. Perhaps it's been a struggle. A delayed bus made your long commute even longer. Perhaps poor air quality forced a sick child to stay home. Perhaps a power cut upset your plans, or maybe there was no water supply today. Or you might tell me your day has gone smoothly. with time well spent, a pleasant morning commute, and a productive workday. Time enjoyed with your family or community. It's positive individual experiences like these that add up to a thriving, healthy city. Today, I want to talk to you about rethinking cities. In particular, what makes cities more equal, more successful, and how we measure that success. This is the right time for this conversation. Urban inequality had been increasing for years, and then came COVID-19. The pandemic has exposed and exacerbated inequalities and underlying weaknesses in our society. One such weakness is that we have not been measuring progress in the right way. To create more equal and prosperous cities that work for both people and the planet, we must stop using only narrow indicators like GDP and income to judge progress. And we must start thinking about people's everyday lived experiences. How people access core urban services like housing, water and sanitation, energy, and transport. What we learned today is that improving everyone's access to core urban services is a better way to create more opportunities and more equal cities. And when these services are inadequate, there is a heavy hidden toll that we've been ignoring for far too long. Before we go any further, here are some important facts. Today, 1 in 2 people live in cities. In low-income countries, 2/3 of those living in cities live in slums or unserviced informal settlements. In these countries that are largely in the global south, about 80% of the urban employment is informal. People who work outside any social safety net, like construction workers, street vendors, waste pickers, domestic workers, and security guards. As cities grow, despite the opportunities they offer, the share of the urban poor is rising. Urban emissions are rising. Vulnerability to the impacts of climate change is rising too. By 2050, 2 in 3 people will live in cities, with the vast majority of this growth occurring in the global south. And these countries are expected to more than double their urban carbon emissions. You don't have to be an expert to understand that this is not sustainable for our planet or for people. 6 years of deep research involving over 160 authors and reviewers from dozens of countries have helped us develop a multi-dimensional roadmap for successful cities where no one is left behind. The synthesis of the World Resources Report Towards a More Equal City breaks down how cities can ensure well-being and opportunities for everyone. I'm proud to present it to you today. How people meet basic daily needs has huge implications for individuals and cities as a whole. Globally, at least 1 out of 3 urban residents lack access to one or more core urban services. There are estimates that unsafe sanitation imposes over $220 billion of costs per year globally in terms of poor health and lost wages. Whereas every dollar invested in water and sanitation leads to anywhere from $4 to $34 of benefits in time savings and health. Traffic congestion costs up to 10% of GDP in large cities like Beijing and Sao Paulo. Whereas shorter commutes can save commuters a third or more of their spent income and can lower air pollution. Our research shows that irrespective of income, living with dependable access to core services saves time and expands opportunities. Conversely, living without access to core services creates tangible burdens. For example, Carolyn lives in Nairobi. 3 times a week, she collects water from the standpipe near her house using 20-liter jerry cans. Sometimes the water service is cut off, so she has to buy water from an informal supplier. Sometimes Carolyn walks 2 kilometers to the closest borehole, waits 4 hours to fill as many jerry cans as she can, and then pays someone with a handcart to bring the water home. Sometimes the water is brown with visible impurities, so she also purchases bottled water to drink. Carolyn is not alone. Based on primary data we collected in 15 major cities, we found that roughly half the citywide populations lacked access to piped water and needed to self-provide just as she has to. It costs time to travel and wait in line for water from a truck or a kiosk. It costs money to purchase water from an informal supplier who may charge inflated rates. And it costs people their health, as the water quality is often dubious. These burdens, what's called the urban services divide, compound over time and across generations to systematically deny people opportunities for a better life. Once you look at it this way, you begin to see this impact everywhere. Luis works as a bus driver in Mexico City. He worries about the poor air quality. Urban sprawl is pushing commuters farther and farther from the city center to where public transport is inaccessible. As a consequence, people are increasingly reliant on unsustainable and expensive modes of transport. The pollution is getting worse, and Luis spends more time stuck in traffic. Our report finds that many people living in cities are like Luis. A study of residents living in peripheral areas of secondary cities in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico found that their commutes cost twice as much and take 3 times as long as more centrally located households. With better land management and urban planning that ensures the provision of decent, affordable housing in locations with good access to services and jobs, this is fixable. But right now, Luis and millions like him are paying for a lack of core services with their time, money, and health. It all adds up to deny people tangible opportunities they could pursue with better access and time saved. And it adds up to deny the city the full potential of its residents' productivity and well-being. It's quite simple. For the urban underserved, every burden carried is an opportunity lost. Every burden shed is an opportunity gained. Add up all the opportunities and lives are transformed. Add up all the lives and cities are transformed. At its core, this report is about individual and collective transformation. But to make that happen, we must reimagine cities. We must rethink what is important. Our research allowed us to dig deeper into what it takes to make cities more equitable and sustainable. We identified 7 powerful cross-sectoral transformations and how they can be achieved. We can think about these transformations in 3 buckets. Number 1, reimagine service provision. Cities need to be more flexible and more ambitious in improving access for the underserved, with greater emphasis on low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure and services. For example, in Durban, Rosario, and Bangkok, informal settlements in flood-prone areas have been upgraded in partnership with community groups. Cities can also expand access to services by integrating informal and alternative service providers and providing financial assistance to upgrade services, as Pune has done for waste collection and Cape Town has done for transport services. Number 2, include the excluded. Cities need to improve data collection to more fully serve the needs of vulnerable residents and to understand the value of the informal economy. Integrating community knowledge and inviting communities to participate in data collection can expose gaps and allow residents to advocate for change. For instance, under an initiative of Slum Dwellers International operating in hundreds of cities, community groups in Nairobi mapped over 50,000 households in informal settlements and could then lobby the city's water and sewer company for more convenient water sources. Number 3, enable lasting change. We find 3 common structural barriers that prevent more equitable access to services in cities: shortfalls in financing, mismanagement of urban land, and misaligned governance processes. Breaking these barriers requires investing more and differently. It requires integrated planning with more transparent land markets, and it means building coalitions and aligning policies around a shared vision. The overall impact is well worth the effort. For example, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and Johannesburg subsidize affordable housing in places that are well connected to jobs and services. This involves aligning spatial development policies across government levels, engaging with local communities, and steering private developers to invest in these areas so that residents of such developments are set up for long-term success. As you can tell, this requires deliberate planning and coordination. The transformations require multiple actors to work together: city and national governments, the private sector, development finance institutions, and civil society, which includes experts, NGOs, and communities. There is no one size fits all, but if you take away one fact from this report, remember this. Across the board, the cumulative benefit of improving access to core services for the underserved far outweighs the investment, particularly in cities of the global south. I've described how access to core urban services can create opportunities and transform the lives of individuals and households in cities. I'll tell you what that's meant for me personally. Back when I was a college student in Delhi, public transport was unreliable, with frequent incidents of harassment. So I used a two-wheeler to commute, which was quite risky on Delhi's dangerous roads and rare for women in that city. But this allowed me to access internships, run errands for my household, and have an active social life. So many opportunities. Frankly, reliable, affordable access to transport was life-changing. It gave me greater independence. It undoubtedly enriched my personal and professional growth. When scaled up across millions of people, access to core services like transport can transform the economies and environments of entire cities. Thankfully, Delhi now has a world-class, non-polluting metro system connecting the area close to my home and my former college. Add up the opportunities created by just one high-quality public transit system. Add up the lives forever changed. That's how we should measure success. And that's how we can transform cities. This World Resources Report, and more importantly, the community that contributed to it, provides a multi-dimensional vision and a roadmap to transform lives and the urban experience across the world. It could not be better timed. COVID-19 is making us all reassess our lives and what is important. We're living in a different world now. Cities are different. The global economy is different. The climate is different. So please, join our shared vision for more equal and sustainable cities. Join us as we help drive urban transformation across the world. This report isn't the end, it's the beginning. Together, it's time to rethink cities. Thank you for listening.
Throughout history, cities have concentrated talent, fueled productivity, and nurtured innovation. But today, soaring inequality is stifling livelihoods and dragging down growth. The World Resources Report, Towards a More Equal City, finds 7 transformations are needed to change course. Reimagine how core services are provided by prioritising the vulnerable and partnering with alternative providers. Include the excluded by gathering granular data at local and community levels and recognising the informal economy, and enable transformative change through better targeted financing, effective spatial planning, and inclusive, well-coordinated governance. These 7 transformations for cities are key to a more equal, more prosperous, more sustainable world.
Now that we know the current state of affairs and transitions that will take us to a more equal city, we'll hear from Michael Keith and Sue Parnell. Michael Keith is Director of Peak Urban Research Program. His research focuses on migration, related processes of urban change. He is professor at the Center on Migration, Policy and Society at the University of Oxford, and he has expertise working outside of the academy in the community and voluntary sector. He was politician for 20 years in the East End of London, and he is co-founder and chair of the Rich Mix Cultural Foundation, the largest multicultural arts centre in the UK. Sue Parnell is Deputy Principal Investigator of the Peak Urban Programme. She is Emeritus Professor at the University of Cape Town. Her research involves liaising with local and national government and international donors. She is on boards of several NGOs concerned with poverty alleviation, sustainability, gender equity in post-apartheid South Africa. We must act now, and we must act in a way that accounts for implications and minimizes unintended consequences. Sue and Michael will give us an approach to action that allows for achieving the intended impact.
Probably everybody listening to this seminar today and our intervention is actually really keen to do something practical and to do something substantive in cities. But before we do that, and we know we have to do that at scale, we have to do it with real impact, our purpose today is to stop and say, how do we do that? How do we think about what we do in ways that will maximize impact? Michael and I have actually been talking an awful lot over the last couple of years, literally with the pandemic, because we're both very actively involved in the leadership of a large program trying to think about cities in contexts of crises, the climate crisis, the pandemic, a number of other crises, socioeconomic crisis. So, and of course we haven't had a chance to talk in person, but it really is good to be able to do that. It might be helpful just to sketch a little bit about where the project that we are both coming from and we're going to talk to each other about originated. It's helpful to understand where the debate about cities is at, and our conversation is definitely part of a bigger conversation about cities in global context. And certainly when the project Peak Urban was devised, it was the moment when we were thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And crucial to that was really the idea that we had to put cities at the forefront of thinking about big global challenges. As I say, biodiversity loss, big population challenges, major challenges in technology, little challenges, but really niggly, difficult things about kind of how do we actually govern some and make the changes that are required. And so Peak Urban really came out of that, and perhaps it was even more important that it was something which was not so much a program or a project that was designed to do things, but to think about how we had to do them. We've got this enormous challenge, this consensus that we had social, economic, environmental imperatives that had to be joined together. And my memory, Michael, is that we were very much concerned with this thing of how do we scale up, how do we make the people who need to actually think about and design and implement these big transformative changes.
I think that's right, Sue. I mean, when we started, I think we brought together really a group of people who were interested in both research, but also interested in the practical workings of cities and how they might work better than they do. And I think what that meant was that it brought us together around a set of ideas, a set of principles really that structured what we tried to do. And I guess there were 7 key principles that structured the program, the Peak Urban program as it became, that influenced the way we worked, the way we thought. And I think all of these are fairly commonsensical, the first of which is that we can't really think of cities as systems straightforwardly. They're always a combination of different systems. You have health systems, you have transport systems, you have economic systems. So this is known as the complex systems. They're complex, they are open, they're subject to rapid change. Cities are never finished, they're always on the move. And what that also means, though, is that we have to respect that they have histories and they have geographies. And that really means that they are locked in to certain kinds of technologies sometimes. Look at Los Angeles and the car that structures the way the city works. But they also have what is known as path dependencies. Part of their histories shapes their economies. The legacies of the colonial rule kind of shape many of the cities of Africa and other places. So those path dependencies and lock-ins are part of the specificity of different cities' past that actually shape their future, what is possible in the future. But that said, we have also in recent years seen an exponential growth in what is commonly called the new urban sciences, an ability to think about the data we generate from cities in cities, by people's movement around the cities, by the digital trace they leave on cities. And so within the new urban sciences, there is a possibility of predicting futures at certain scales, and we recognize that, but also we recognize that it is qualified. And the reason it's qualified is that we're also conscious that cities are the place where things happen, where newness comes into the world. So the fourth of our 7 principles is that we have to recognize that dynamic of continually changing landscapes in cities. But then the fifth principle that we recognized was that knowledge works in very interesting ways and important ways in cities themselves. If you think about the biology of cities in the context of the climate crisis, the metabolism of cities creates a science of the way the city generates carbon. But that science has a different logic to it, to the way we think about the economically optimal form of the city. That science in turn may work slightly differently from the science of public health. So alongside different systems, we have different sciences that make sense of the city, and how we bring these together was the fifth of the principles that we were thinking about. The sixth of the principles also was that we know that the forms of disruption in the city are frequently generated by rapid technological change. A single piece of new kit in health means that the logic of the organisation of public health systems changes.
Like a vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about the ways in which the online world changes both economy and culture, what we can do economically, what we do culturally, how we behave in cities, technology changes the interface of different cities. Which is why in the final of the 7 principles we thought was really important was in this context of rapidly changing cities, we need to think carefully about the ways in which research relates to the knowledges produced in the city. How we share knowledges between different parties, the public sector, private sector, community organisations, but also how research translates into practical impacts on the grounds in cities to help cities make sense of their futures.
I really liked that when we were starting off, so the sense that you don't trivialize the really fundamental ways that you don't see an individual city, but that which you have to understand all cities and the urban process in a way. And for me that was really important in bringing together lots of different kinds of people from different disciplines, from different places, even some people who weren't they were thought leaders, but not necessarily straight scholars.
I think that's right. I think that's why we normally talk about what a peak approach to thinking about city futures might mean. Yeah. It means that dispositionally we actually think about the sorts of questions that it's important to ask in order to make sense of our futures that recognize those divergent principles that we started with.
So what I quite like about the peak approach is that for me it started off almost as a device for trying to bring quite a big cohort of people together into one place where we all understood the same sorts of things that needed to be done or needed to be thought about. And it was almost formulaic, but I found in the process of reviewing PEAK, P-E-A-K, and worth spelling out what each of those letters means in the acronym, that it opened up as many questions for action as it prescribed in the immediate first instance. So for example, on the P, on which came out of the sort of science of urban science, if you like, the new urban sciences, where people talk about prediction. But is really about kind of what do you measure? How do you measure it? At what scale do you measure things? What do you need to know about cities? Some people think about that as an urban observatory. And that P at first was a way to embrace just literally that new data science, new ways, techniques of doing things. But I think what it has become in our program, and it's become very live, that it's absolutely about new data science, but it's much more than that. It's about how do you bring in other methods? How do you integrate methods in a robust kind of way? How do you actually deal with both backcasting and forecasting in cities? So when I think, and I try to communicate to others in the team and to the external people in cities, that why I think peak is useful and why I think the P is not just the normal information management that cities might have. I try to sort of ask myself, and we ask together, if you were going to change the trajectory of cities, what do you need to be able to predict?
And I think that's why if you open up a city observatory in a different city, in a different part of the globe, it will always look slightly different. Partly because of the sort of data that is there, but also partly because of the sort of data that you're looking for. So that sense of P is about the use of data, as well as the acquisition of data, as well as the modelling of data. Because we know that if cities are on the move, in most ways, that sense of newness gives us the second letter of the acronym, the E, which stands for emergence. And emergence, as I said earlier, is really about how we think about that notion of the city as a crucible of change. Change in terms of ideas, change in terms of economic systems. It is always about combinations of the material and the cultural. It's about the ways people behave, but it's also about the way the city works. So we have to ask ourselves, what kinds of emergence is in play right now? What sort of propensity, what sort of possibility is the city opening up, both in terms of value? So we might ask ourselves, what values are at stake? So if we're thinking about an interplay between people's welfare generally, how long they live, how do we think about that being an emergent trend within a city alongside its economic wealth?
I think for me what's really interesting in that E is that, if you get two urban economists to talk to each other, they will identify things that two engineers may not identify.
Absolutely, absolutely, which is why engineers value some things, and economists may value other things, and public health professionals may value something else. And how we find their values commensurable is partly about the ways we produce knowledge of the city, but it's also something deeply normative. It's about what kind of city we want, in whose image the city will be made. So it's a deeply moral choice about the sorts of cities that we shape in the future. But it's also about what kinds of choices might be made in the face of those new technologies, the kind of emergence that comes from things like energy transition in the face of the climate crisis. We see, when we look at places around the world, in somewhere like Haiti, you try the market to produce energy and you find there are deep problems of market failure when you create new energy systems in Haiti, and then you try state-owned energy systems and you find there's forms of state capture and different kinds of problems. So how we think about that balance between markets and hierarchies, what the state does and what the market does.
So Michael, how do you understand then what's the A in the peak? I mean, how different is that from tracking things and understanding how they come together and the catalysm and the energy that you've ascribed to the P and the E? What's A?
Well, I think A is a sense of the sorts of practices that are adopted. And by practice, on the one hand, we may mean very specific forms of technological disruption. The digital world is the most obvious case in point. So some of the research we've done on peak by colleagues in Cape Town has looked at the ways in which financial systems for migrants change with the advent of online money. You have very old systems like the Havala system, by which money is transferred in remittances globally, transnationally, in incredibly clever ways. But now with the advent of online money, the dynamics change, the social organizations change, the hierarchies change. And so it can be something very specific like a piece of technology, but it's also more broadly about a general sense of practice and the kinds of systems that we see emerging, not least in the face of the pandemic. What does it mean for a post-pandemic city to think about the sorts of practices that begin to foreground priorities of public health, for example? Public health systems have tended to reflect simple separations between forms of healthcare that you go to a doctor or a medical practitioner and forms of hospitals. Now, in a 21st century context, that's changed partly because the technology of big tech has changed from MRI scanners down to defibrillators, but it's also changed because of the ways in which people work, they think about their health. We think about public health about through how much people walk, how they use the city.
And it's interesting because that's what leads you then onto the K of kind of people watch each other's practices changing and they seek to learn from each other sometimes, or to learn by not doing what others are doing. I don't want that.
I think that's right, because part of the change and the kind of movement through the acronym is generated by asking ourselves some very basic questions about each of these letters in turn, in a sense, so that when we're thinking about practice and the kinds of adoption, the A, what kinds of practice are being adopted in a novel fashion? Now, how does one get hold of that? How does one understand it? Parts of the ways one understands that are rooted in knowledge that is deeply embedded in systems that may be within the community, within the niches of the private sector, within parts of the public sector. Yeah. We need to think about how we share knowledge. So the question then becomes, the sorts of questions we might begin to think about under the K, I think maybe are about sharing knowledge. But I think
that's right. I think we understand probably K more easily than we understand many of the other P, E, A, and K. But for me, what's important in the urban space in particular is because it brings together so many different forms of knowledge. The K here is about valuing expert knowledge, but recognizing that there are very different kinds of expert knowledge, valuing that experts don't have all knowledge, and valuing that people actually often generate knowledge based on a particular place in response to a particular crisis. And the climate crisis is a very good example of that, where it's new, we've got to relearn things. And so there's the K. And I think that really then brings us to the sort of overall thing of saying, this is a disposition, this is a way of seeing the city, it's about a way of asking ourselves a set of questions, rather than simply being a case of saying you've got to do this and you've got to do that, and until you've done all of these things. It says, at a moment when we recognize that what we have is precious, urban life, urban culture, urban place, urban economies, we also have fundamental challenges to it. And so we've got to be really on our toes.
I think that's right, because we know that knowledge lands in place as well as cities start from place. So we respect the engineer in what you're saying, you respect the economist, you respect the health professional, but you also respect the fact that different forms of cultural relations, different gender relations, different social relations.
And different institutions.
Exactly. All of these forms of knowledge land differently in different parts of the world. A mass transit system will not land in the same way in Dar es Salaam as it will in Los Angeles. And recognizing that difference is part of this disposition that is about a sense of knowledge exchange, I think, that acknowledges how cities are on the move.
So I think what's been fabulous about Peak and P, E, A, K, you can have a look at the stuff on the website, and there really are some grounded examples of what we're talking about. And what we really are hoping for as a result of this project is not a set of findings from particular findings, but rather that we shift the conversation about what to do and how to do it and who we need to do it with.
Well, this is goodbye from me. It was, again, an honor to be here with you sharing this moment. Please, if you haven't done so already, leave your comments in the chat and register to receive the briefing afterwards if you haven't done so. We heard from WRI the transformations towards a more equal city, and from Peak Urban, an approach to implement those transformations. Now, Tim Schwanen, professor at the University of Oxford, will close us off. Tim is Director of Transport Studies Unit at the School of Geography and Environment. His research concentrates on the geographies of everyday mobilities of people, goods, and information. He has worked in various universities in Europe and conducted research in Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
Hello, I'm Tim, and I'm one of the researchers on the Peak Urban program. I would like to reinforce and fully endorse the 7 transformations identified by the World Resources Institute. I don't want to go through all of them again because you've already seen them. I just want to highlight 2 and illustrate them with some of the points that have emerged from the research I've been involved in. I think it's particularly important that we privilege the most vulnerable groups in the city in infrastructure design and delivery. In some of the work we've been doing with women in peripheral neighborhoods in Medellin, Colombia, we've seen how important that is. These women really are very vulnerable in all kinds of ways. And we've done a research project with them during the pandemic. They were extraordinarily hard hit by the pandemic. And our research brought out how resilient and adaptive they've been. But we should not romanticize that resilience, because I'm sure that if better infrastructures for mental health, for transport, better labor markets had been in place, they would have had a much easier time. We need to think, however, about who in the city is vulnerable as well. In some of the other research I've been involved in as part of PEAK, we've worked with auto rickshaw drivers in Bengaluru, India. Now, these drivers have a bit of a bad reputation. They are often seen as money grabbing and as setting off their customers. But they would not do that if it wasn't for a reason. In the research that we've done, we've looked at the implications that the rise of mobility platforms like Uber and Ola have for them. It turns out that these platforms make it much more difficult for them to earn a living and make their situation even more precarious. This suggests that digitalization is not always a force for the good, and digital infrastructures can make precarious workers even more precarious than they already were. It's also important to think carefully about how we arrange land markets in the city. And this is also important with a view to public transport development. Cities around the world are investing large sums of money in the development of bus rapid transit networks and metros. They also try to concentrate the development of new houses, of new employment, new retail at or around stops in the public transport network. And from a transport point of view, that is really great. That is how you can avoid getting people driving their own cars. But what often happens also is that around those stops in the transport network, that you see land values go up, rents go up, which means that the poorest households in the city get displaced. They have to move to elsewhere in the city, whereas in theory, they could benefit extensively from the better accessibility by public transport if those new connections were also affordable to them. And this brings us to something very important, and that is the trade-offs that are inevitably involved in urban development. Projects like PEAK Urban and similar research projects give us the frameworks and the tools to think about these trade-offs. And they allow decision makers in cities to understand some of the pros and cons of the various options. It is very important that those decision makers and researchers work together to collectively make the city more resilient, more sustainable, more equitable. I would like to thank you for watching this video and for participating in this seminar. I would like to extend a special gratitude to the Resilience Hub for allowing this seminar to be part of their program. And I wish you a very inspiring conference.